Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Writing Podcast. I'm your host Adam, and as always, I'm here with my co-host Lindsay Broker. We have a good one here for you today. We have Libbie Hawker on the show. We interviewed her in a previous podcast about her fiction work, her historical fiction, but recently she started putting out some really helpful nonfiction guides on writing and plotting and things. So that's one reason why we brought her on the show. So Libbie, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks. Good to be back.
Yep, sort of back, right? So
Yeah.
we split off, but so we may ask you some more stuff that we already covered on the other show because we don't know who's watched both. So let's just start out kind of where you started. How did you start out writing and especially get into the self-publishing scene?
Well, I've always really liked writing, like pretty much everybody listening would be my guess. Wanted to be a professional writer since I was a little kid. It was like my only real career aspiration. I really started to get serious about pursuing it and making, it a goal to actually have a career as a writer in 2008. And at that time, I finished up a novel and went out and got an agent, which was a big simplification of the process on that. And she tried to sell my book, and she wasn't able to do it. I eventually ended up working with a second agent, also couldn't sell my book or any other book that I put out there. So at some point, I just kind of decided, well, I've pretty much submitted this one particular historical novel to every conceivable publisher who would be interested, and they've all rejected it, so I might as well just self-publish it and see what happens. So I just self-published a book sort of as an afterthought, and it found its audience fairly quickly and started to take off, and at that point I pulled everything else from submission to publishers and stopped submitting to new agents, and I just decided to go full-on with self-publishing. So that's what I did.
Okay, awesome. And so you said you started submitting in 2008. How long was it before you stopped doing that and you did go the self-publishing route?
My first agent actually started submitting to publishers in, I think, 2010. I got the agent in like early 2009, and it took us until about 2010 to start submitting. And then I self-published my first book in September of 2011. So it's been about 4 years, a little more than 4 years since I first started self-publishing now. So yeah, that's how it's all shaken out.
That's like forever in self-publishing time. So
I know.
you started way back when. So. And for those that don't know, you mentioned that the first book you put out was a historical novel. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What was it exactly?
Sure. It's called The Sekhmet Bed. It was the first novel I ever completed, actually. So my first book, and it's a historical novel set in ancient Egypt, and once it started selling pretty well as a self-published book, I turned it into a 4-book series. So I also have those 4 books set in ancient Egypt that kind of take off from there, and then I have a few other books out. Not all of them are historical fiction, and yeah, but that's probably what I'm best known for among fiction readers is the Egyptian historical stuff.
Awesome, and I won't get too far into the outlining stuff now because I want to ask you some more questions. I know Lindsay has a lot of outlining questions, so but I'll ask, did you outline that first book or no?
The very first one I did not outline. I also did not outline the second book I ever wrote, which was a literary novel, which took me 2 years to finish. And it was only 60,000 words, so that was pretty ridiculous. But I very quickly started outlining after that because I realized in order to take advantage of kind of the faster time scale that you can move on with self-publishing, I needed a much more organized and efficient process to write my books. So I started learning everything I could about story structure and about the process of outlining, and I started experimenting with a lot of different methods to figure out what would consistently develop good results for me. So the third book I wrote, which was The Crook and Flail, which is the second book in the Egyptian series I mentioned, took me 3 weeks to write. So definitely a big improvement over 2 years.
Yeah, just a little, cutting it down by,
yeah.
almost 100 months or something. So, right.
Yeah.
So, with that, with the historical fiction, I know we talked on the other show before how if you can find a niche in there where people are hungry for that specific thing, you could do really well, especially. But when you first started out, what was the reasoning behind doing that? Is that just the genre that you liked, or you were really interested in Egyptian culture? What made you start with that line of books?
Yeah, first and foremost, I've just always really loved historical fiction. It's mostly what I read. I'll get a little more experimental than that and check out some other stuff too, but for the most part, my reading for pleasure is almost always historical fiction, especially if it's set in an ancient culture. And I've always loved ancient Egypt, so it was just kind of natural for me to to go for ancient Egypt as the setting for my first book, and it's done well enough for me that particular 4-book series that actually at the end of this month I'm going to be launching a new Egyptian series. So got a whole new set of Egypt books coming out soon. So it's fun to write in. The nice part about being so obsessed with ancient Egypt is that I have to do very little research, so it definitely helps speed up the writing process a lot when you just kind of have it all in your head already. So that's helpful.
Right, for sure. And so have you taken advantage of this yet and wrote off a trip to the pyramids and the Sphinx yet, or still not yet?
Not yet. I really, really want to, but it's so politically unstable out there right now. It's probably a bad idea at this point in time. But I am really excited to do it. I'm going to be at the Historical Novel Society conference out in Denver this summer, and I'm going to be speaking on a panel with two Egyptologists. So they're like real Egyptologists, and I'm going to be sitting there as like, I write fiction about Egypt. So I'll kind of be the fish out of water, but it should be a pretty fun experience.
Yeah, that's awesome, and it just shows kind of where you can wiggle yourself into with this stuff. So.
Yeah.
All right, so one of the big reasons we brought Libbie on the show, we always like having you on, obviously, but was for the blurbs and the plotting. So you've came out with those 2 fiction books, and we'll start with the blurb book. I know that one's been out for quite a while, but can you talk about that, give us the name of it, and all that good stuff?
Yeah, I was catching up on some bookkeeping that I should have been more diligent about today, and I was looking back through my old records, and I put that book out in October of 2014. I was like, oh wow, it goes back that far. So that book's called Gotta Read It, 5 Simple Steps to a Fiction Pitch That Sells. And it's just a real simple way you can condense your entire huge novel into a nice, compact product description or blurb or even a query letter if you're going to be going after agents and publishers that will sell your book really well without bogging it down with too many details and a lot of distractions. So I know it's something that a lot of authors have a really difficult time with. I've been helping people craft these either query letters or back cover copy for their books for a really long time, for many, many years on the internet. So I've had a lot of practice at it. So that's my kind of foolproof method for getting one out that will attract readers to your book.
And so the title of it has pitching in there, but just to clarify, it's not just to sell to agents and things like that, though it would work with that, I assume, but it's more pitching it to people coming across it on Amazon and things, right?
Right, yeah. The nice thing about this method is it works equally well whether you're trying to reach an agent and you're doing a query letter or whether you're just writing back cover copy like you would have on the back of a paperback or like you would have in the product description on an Amazon page. It's essentially the same thing no matter what you do, and the goal is the same with both types of copywriting. You're trying to get somebody interested in reading that entire book. So it works either way.
Right. So I don't want to go through and make you tell us all the secrets in the book because we want to leave some incentive for people to buy after listening to the show, right? But
yeah.
One thing that I've noticed with blurbs that don't sell, authors are very afraid, and this goes for me as well early on, back when we first published, 2012, we were really afraid to put anything in there that would give too much away. Spoilers, things like that. So, for instance, at the beginning of a book, we had someone that gets turned into a vampire. But we didn't want to mention that in the blurb, yet if we didn't, they won't know it's a vampire book. So what's that kind of balance of not telling enough in the blurb and telling too much?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, you don't want to spoil the book, really, but you also do need to hit whatever keynotes are going to appeal to that particular audience. So yeah, in your case, if you've got some vampire elements in there, you obviously want to attract those readers who are into vampires, so you have to mention something about vampires in the blurb, or make it like really gothy sounding, something that really strikes the right note with that particular group of readers. And I think people should be less concerned about, well, how can I rephrase this? I think a bigger problem that I tend to see among most people who are trying to write blurbs on their own is that they tend to put in too much information. Like, they aren't necessarily afraid of spoiling stuff, but they're sort of afraid that like the reader's not gonna get what they're talking about, so they like load in all these world-building details and all these, you know, names of all these characters and names of gods and names of countries, and it's just like world-building overdose, and you're like, oh, I don't know what's going on here. So the method in the book helps you narrow it down on what's really important in the story, what those 5 key elements are that are going to attract a reader to your book and make them feel an emotional investment in buying it, or if they're an agent, requesting the full manuscript and reading it and finding out what's going on in that entire story. So it kind of focuses, instead of focusing on world building and what's so creative and unique about your book, it focuses on really how your book is just like every other book in the world, honestly. It helps you kind of narrow that focus on aspects of your story that will really speak to readers on an emotional level and like suck them in even before they've done the look inside on there. So it's a nice method.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned that you want to give some of the plot points, especially the early on ones, so that they know what they're getting into. You don't want if they have no idea, if they're going in blindly, you're probably going to lose a lot of people like ours. If in the beginning, if vampire fans would have went to it and read it, and there's no mention of vampires, they probably wouldn't have bought it, just like you said. So where do you kind of draw the line of how far into the book you're willing to go with a blurb, if that makes sense? Like how far into the plot should you go? More than a couple chapters, or not past the first chapter, or?
Well, instead of having people think about it in terms of like chapter or setup for your book, I encourage people to think of it in terms of looking at sort of the core elements that are driving your story all the way through from beginning to end. So you're going to focus on, first of all, your main character. You usually just have one main character, but some stories have more than one, and I kind of go over how to handle that in the book. But you have a character, and your character wants something specific, so you focus on that in the blurb too. What are they after? And then there's some sort of opposing force. There's an antagonist of some kind, so you tell how the character struggles against this opposing force. And then you don't want to, in the end of any story, a character either succeeds or fails at achieving their goal. You don't want to tell the reader whether they succeed or fail, because that's spoiling the whole book, so instead you mention what's at stake. So by focusing on that character, desire, antagonist, struggle, and stakes, you create this whole, you create like an image, basically, this little snapshot of a really complete and compelling story. It kind of reassures the reader before they even buy that this is going to be a story that carries them all the way through. It doesn't bog down, it doesn't get boring, and they know it's going to have like a complete arc and a satisfying ending. So that's actually how I suggest people do it. Instead of focusing on specifics of the plot, you kind of want to focus on the character and their little path they take.
Right, that makes sense, and that sort of mirrors, in a way, the act structure, or we're going to get into outlining and plotting. It sort of mirrors that in a little bit, like the beginning of the hero's journey part. Just go and tell, what's at stake and what's the opposing force, it sounds like. So,
yeah.
Have you also found that the blurbs need to be vastly different as far as structure between genres, or is it pretty much universal that the same structure for your blurb works for romance as it does with epic fantasy? Just obviously the elements are going to be different, but is the same structure there, or?
I believe very strongly that it is the same structure no matter what genre you're writing. And that's because I think it doesn't really matter what genre you're writing. There are certain specific things in story that appeal universally to the human mind. There's stuff that draws us to a story that's almost universal for practically every person out there, and it really doesn't. I mean, genre is really immaterial. The only way genre really comes into this this whole process is if a genre convention dictates that you have more than one main character. So for romance, for example, you almost always have two main characters, your hero and heroine, or if it's a same-sex romance, your two heroes or whatever. And you have to kind of show how their two stories sort of intersect, which I go over in the book too. And sometimes in bigger books like epic fantasies, you have multiple main characters, and they're all kind of interacting and going on their own journeys that sort of converge around this central idea. The Egyptian series I'm working on, the new one right now, is that kind of story. At the peak of that book, I have like 14 main characters, so figuring out how I was going to write the blurbs for each of those books was definitely a challenge, even with all the practice I've had for it. Yeah, I think it's always what draws us to a story is watching a character go through this struggle. I mean, certain sort of trappings and more superficial aspects of a story will attract us depending on what our personal tastes are. If you like sci-fi, you're going to be looking for stuff that's got spaceships and aliens in it. If you like romance, you're going to be looking for something that's got a love story in it. If you like historical fiction, you're looking for an exotic setting in a different time period. But you're always looking for that satisfying feeling of watching a person go through this course of change as they kind of pursue a goal. So yeah, that's I think you can't really go wrong, no matter what your genre is, with sticking to the struggle of your main character.
That makes sense. And so with we've talked about this before. The attention span of someone looking to purchase it can be really low. Like if you don't hook them in the first one or two sentences, they may be gone. So do you have any advice on? I won't go into past this for the blurb, but maybe the first couple sentences to at least make them continue with the blurb, because I know even myself, I'm guilty of if I go to it and I see something that's like, John is a carpenter, he works at, and I'm like, okay, I don't care. Click.
Yeah, like, neat.
Yeah, so you need to state the theme right away, or how do you make sure they're going to finish the blurb?
I'm not sure if there are any hard and fast rules on that. I think a lot of it might have to do with the tone of voice you're using as you write that blurb. I think you kind of can't go wrong with trying to work something about your setting in fairly early, or I shouldn't say setting, but something about a genre convention in somewhere early on. If it's your cover is hopefully going to do a lot to sort of convey what the genre is anyway. Excuse me. So it's not really necessary that you like hammer it home in the first line of your sentence that like this is romance or whatever. But yeah, it's helpful if you kind of set the stage a little bit within the first couple of sentences. That will sort of allow people to either cling to that and keep reading if it's their cup of tea, or to be like, nah, I'm out of here if it's clearly not the right book for them. So.
Right. So on that same topic, it's said a lot, and like you said, you've answered this on forums a lot too, when people are like, why aren't my books selling? Usually, first thing is to have a good cover to get them to your product page, and then it's the product description or the blurb like you're talking about, and then to get them to the sample. So speaking of how that can increase sales, do you have any experience with changing just a blurb and it has increased sales, or do you know of other people that have experienced that?
I've seen lots of people. I actually have received a lot of emails from people who tried out the method in my book and would email me like all elated because their sales went significantly higher after they got a better blurb up there. So yeah, I definitely have heard from a lot of people that it has been a big improvement for them. So that's nice. It's encouraging. It's nice to know my advice can help people. And the book's only $1, so it's cheap advice too.
Yep, for sure. All right, I have 2 more questions wrote up over here, and then I'll pass you on to Lindsay, who's going to get into the new book of yours, the real meat of the show, the plotting and outlining book. So
Okay.
this is kind of a spin-off to the blurb, is taglines I see is pretty important. BookBub, for instance, if you're lucky enough to get one with them, they always use a shortened blurb or a tagline. Do you have any advice in your book on taglines like that? Like, I know a lot of blurbs in the beginning will have one bolded sentence. It's a tagline to get people hooked to read the blurb. Do you have any advice on those, or?
I touch on it very briefly in sort of an abstract way in the book, where I address the question of whether or not to use questions in your blurb. So I kind of mentioned that I think there are certain times when questions, which for some reason when people think about writing taglines, there's so often questions. Like, what would you do if you woke up and everyone was a zombie or whatever, So I do touch on it briefly in kind of just giving my opinion on how effective questions are in terms of sort of kicking off a blurb. I didn't really go into great depth on it, though, because I don't often use taglines for most of my blurbs. I do with some of them, just because they seem to fit in with the structure okay, and I'm like, yeah, all right, I'll throw that in there. But I don't feel like they're necessary. They're not as necessary as really nailing the structure of the blurb and making sure it's doing its job of pulling somebody in. So I didn't really. Something that I think maybe some people have complaints about with my like how-to books is that I tend to just really stick to whatever the focus of that book is and not to digress into these other related areas. So maybe I'll add something into like an updated edition about taglines.
That would be good, because I know one, I can't think of his name. I'll try to look it up and put it in the notes. There is someone really popular that's doing covers right now. He was at one of the conferences recently, and I listened to the whole thing for like an hour, and I still can't remember his name. Sorry, whoever you are, sorry. I'll remember and put you in the comments, and I'll edit this out on audio, right? So, but he talks about how if you want your book to sell or look more professionally, come up with a tagline to put on the cover itself, and then also use it in the blurb. So that's one reason I asked, is it seems like a lot more people are trying to form their books to look like they're traditionally published or traditionally done, and almost all of those have some sort of tagline. So definitely be good if you can update that book if you have some more information on taglines. So, all right,
Yeah.
one more question.
if it's becoming kind of a trend that people... Okay. Whoa. I think I lost you there. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, you're freezing up just a little bit, but you can go ahead with what you're going to say. I was just going to go into the next question, so I think you have a little bit of delay, but that's okay.
Yeah, I think we've got some lag between us. That's a bummer. No, I was just going to say, and if it's a trend that people are starting to focus on, then yeah, I'll definitely do like a revised edition and put it in there. And whether or not a tagline appears on a traditionally published book might be like very much a genre trend thing, because like in historical fiction, it's like very rare to find a tagline, so that could be influencing my perceptions of it. So anyway, that was all I said before I froze.
All right, and no worries, you're just on a little bit of delay, so we may end up talking over each other a little bit, but we'll figure it out. So,
yeah,
all right, last question before I pass you on to Lindsay. So on the same topic of blurbs, I know that the product description on Amazon with the blurb in it, the formatting is pretty important as well. Like one thing that I hate is when I'm looking through and the first like 5 paragraphs of the blurb are accolades and reviews and things like that. However, it seems like all traditional books do that, and I have noticed some really popular indie books doing that. Not to call her out, but Mimi was on the show recently with her new pen name series, and I went to check it out. Someone bought a copy through one of the affiliate links. That's what reminded me of it on our site. So I went to it, and I noticed that on hers also you have to click the read more to get to the actual description. Do you advise against that if you're not a well-known author, or do you think the actual formatting of the description doesn't really matter?
I don't think it matters so much, because you're going to turn away maybe a few readers with that, but you might be attracting an equal number of readers who are like, ooh, look at all these accolades. So I think it's kind of a roll of the dice either way, if you want to do it or try it without it and see if your sales change at all. So I'm always a big fan of experimenting with stuff and seeing if it works or not, and then just going with whatever seems to stick.
Right. All right. Well, that was a lot of good information on blurbs. I'm sure a lot of the people listening, downloading this in the future, are already like pausing, like I gotta go change my blurbs right now. So.
Good.
All right. So we will pass it over to Lindsay to talk about your new book. So, Lindsay.
All right. Well, let's see if I'm hopefully not laggy, or I won't be laggy to me. How does that sound?
There you go.
I would like to say that as far as taglines and accolades and things, sometimes people will look at examples of like, oh, Stephen King has all these accolades on his book blurb, so I should be doing that, not realizing that he could put like, this is a book, buy it in his description, and it would sell for him. So, yeah. I think it's a good idea to like look at the top 100 in your genre or something and kind of see what's working now. That's just my 2 cents on that.
That seems pretty sound to me.
All right, well, as far as the new book goes, Take Off Your Pants. Yeah, I was doing that while you guys were talking. It was fun. Could you tell us a little bit about the benefits of outlining instead of just pantsing, as it were, or writing on the fly?
Yeah, so I know this can be a sensitive subject for many writers, so I just want to say up front that in the book, Take Off Your Pants, I'm very clear that, like, if your writing by the seat of your pants method works for you and you like it and you don't want to change anything about it, then go for it. Like, I don't think that there's only one way to skin a cat. But the main reason why I wanted to do a book on outlining is because if you're looking for a way to earn a steady living as a writer, whether you're talking about doing like a hybrid career where you're working with self-publishing and working with a traditional publisher at the same time, or whether you're just all indie publishing all the time, a really major component of how quickly you can get to the point where you can write full-time is how large your backlist is. And obviously, your backlist will increase faster if you can write books faster. So obvious it hardly needs to be stated, right? So if you outline books in a way that that gives you a real strong structure where you know you're going to have a compelling story that really carries the reader from beginning to end without, too many digressions or places where it bogs down and you lose the reader's attention, then you know you're going to build up a strong backlist faster and hang on to more readers. So I wanted to get this outlining method out there that I use to, in case it helps other people to increase their backlists a little bit faster. Or I use an anecdote from my from my recent career in the book too, where for my publisher they wanted me to write a book on a fairly tight deadline, and I was able to commit to doing that and turned it in on time because I used this outlining method to ensure that I knew where the story was going ahead of time, and that I, more crucially I think than just knowing where your story's going, I knew that it was going to be a very compelling story that readers would have a hard time putting down before I even started writing it. And the fact that I could crank it out in 3 weeks was just the icing on the cake, you know. So this method that I kind of go over in Take Off Your Pants, it will just basically help you, if you're ever under a tight deadline, or if you ever want to increase your backlist as quickly as possible, it will allow you to do that with maximum efficiency and minimum time. So that's what it is.
Speaking as someone who kind of has transitioned from a pantser to an outliner, it's definitely more efficient when you know exactly when you sit down. Like today, I'm going to write this scene, and this happens. It's just, you're just writing it. You're not sitting there struggling to find your way, and you don't end up having to cut out scenes later and that kind of thing. So definitely.
Yeah, that's the thing that's always really bothered me about pantsing, which there are some really great benefits to just kind of going by the seat of your pants and seeing where your creativity takes you. Like, you can come up with some really cool stuff, and it can be really fun and like refreshing to write that way. So that's a perk. But every time I've done it, I've ended up having to cut out tens of thousands of words later. Tens, I mean like 30, 40,000 words in some cases. That is so much time wasted. So when I'm in a situation where I really can't afford to waste time, I have to use this method in order to just like work efficiently and just drive through my deadlines and hit all my goals on time.
For sure, and I could see where with some genres it might be a little easier to pants than others, or some types of stories. Like I found with the romances, it was a pretty simple adventure story in a romance that you kind of have a really good idea what's going to happen. But if you're talking about a mystery or maybe epic fantasies or something where you layer in all these subplots and that kind of thing, I definitely think outlining would be useful.
Yeah, definitely. And then the method I go over specifically, a lot of people expressed some pleasant surprise after they after they read the book, because it's not really your typical. I think when people think of outlining, they think of like, okay, well, I'm gonna first this scene's gonna happen, and then this scene's gonna happen, and then this scene. So instead of it being this like plot-focused, scene-focused way of constructing a story, it focuses very, very much on taking a character through a compelling sort of personal journey. They're going after some external goal too, usually. Well, hopefully, otherwise it gets a little boring. Too navel-gazing that way. But you're basically like taking this character through this arc of change where they start out with something they need to fix about their personality. They may not even be aware of it yet, but everyone else is. And you kind of watch them as they progress through this change. So it makes it really compelling, and what's best is it actually applies equally, that like character arc type of thing, no matter what genre you're going to consider writing. So it works great in sci-fi, works great in romance, works great in literary fiction, anything. So yeah, it's been, I think a lot of people have really enjoyed the process of looking at an outline not as like a sequence of related events, but instead as this sequence of internal change within one or more characters.
Yeah, that sounds really, it does sound different and interesting. I know I just kind of sit down and go chapter by chapter in a linear way. Is it just to make it more fun for outlining, or what do you think the benefit is of kind of doing this different way?
In my opinion, it makes a story much more compelling, and it gives you this sort of safety net before you start writing to know that you're writing a book that readers are going to have a really hard time putting down. It's sort of, you're following this kind of like psychological trick, basically, that makes people feel emotionally invested in your story. So instead of just going, just kind of like hoping that the sequence of events is cool enough that people are like, ooh, neat, I want to see what happens next. Instead, you're like doing this kind of mind trick where they're like, oh my god, I can't look away from this. It's like a soap opera on the page. So the benefit for me is knowing before I even start to write that this story is going to move very tightly. It's going to be fast-paced so that people just like keep turning the pages. And also that it's going to feel satisfying on an emotional level, so that people are going to get to the end of that book. Like even if you have, like I have a lot of really bad characters in my books. Like I don't know why, I'm really drawn to people who are just like messed up and unpleasant. But this method allows me to like take somebody all the way to the end of the book, and almost everybody still feels like it was a great story, even though you probably want to punch every character in the face by the time you get to the end of it. So yeah, it's all just about this sort of emotional investment that you can sort of induce in a reader by following a few little tricks.
Okay, I'm definitely gonna have to check that out, because I've got your blurbing book, and I find those, I think you have like 5 points or something you go over, just really helpful to have there when you're getting started. I'm kind of curious, I don't know how related it is, but let's say you're working on a series and you're like 8 books in, and your main character is probably not going to have a huge growth arc because he's just Duffy the vampire slayer. So
Yeah.
does it still work, or do you still focus on the main character, or do you maybe try a side character?
Yeah, I mean, you can do either way. One of the neat things about this method is that your character can come up with new little personal problems in each successive book if you want. So like I have, in my 4-book Egyptian series, I have the same main character in 3 of those 4 books. But in each book, she's kind of facing a different sort of emotional crisis that she has to get herself through. And she's also pursuing these sort of external goals to try to get the things she wants just for herself at the same time. So she changes as a person, but in 3 different ways in each of these books. So you can do that approach where you have like a discrete, separate issue in each volume of the series. Or if you want, you can do this like overarching, longer running character arc where even though your character kind of struggles in each book, they haven't really achieved their full, hero's journey type of thing. Like Harry Potter, for example, that's like 8 books of Harry sort of pursuing the same internal goal, and like he finally gets there in the last book. So yeah, you can choose to do it either way you want, whatever kind of appeals to you more. So that's a little flexible that way, which is nice.
It sounds good, and I suppose even though you've had the same character for a while, it does get boring if they don't continue to kind of change and grow in some way over the course of the series.
Yeah, it gets really boring for your readers, but even worse, it gets boring for you. Like, who wants to sit down and pound out 80,000, 90,000 new words in a series if you know the character's just going to be like doing the same thing, It's not very fun.
No, it seems to work for episodic TV.
It seems to, but if you actually look below the surface, and because I'm a big fan of the fact that like storytelling is the same whether you're talking about book or TV or movies or whatever, but if you look at like sitcoms, someone has a new problem in each one, and usually it's not just like an external problem, it's also some sort of like, so-and-so is shy, and it's going to affect their ability to achieve this goal, or so-and-so is, if you think about like Sheldon on The Big Bang Theory, like that's his personal quirks are always sort of what drives his larger problems within the plot. So you can kind of think of it that way too. Like there's always some little conflict going on, even in episodic TV, where you have sort of these characters that appear on the surface to be very concrete and unchanging.
Gotcha. Of course, then the next week they forget all about that epiphany they had, and they're the same character again.
Yeah, classic. Stephanie Plum, right? In the those Janet Ivanovich or whatever her name is. Can't remember. It's been a long time since I looked at books for her.
We'll have to do a whole show on series on another time. But kind of for the people who, I know a lot of the pantsers will argue that outlining makes things boring for them because they've already discovered the story and know what's going to happen. Do you have anything to say to that? I mean, I think they're wrong, but there's always more to discover.
Well, I do present sort of an alternative method in the book where if you are a pantser and if you like to discover a lot about the story, it sort of gives you an open-endedness. Like you can stop at a certain point and it'll give you a lot of discovery that you can still make happen. But at the same time, you'll still have this reassurance from the get-go that you're definitely going to have a compelling story before you start writing. So you can do that. But also, I mean, there's fun to pants. It is. It's really fun to just like go crazy and write whatever comes into your head and see what comes out. That can be super great and rewarding, but it's typically not a very efficient way of writing. So if your concern is efficiency and maintaining like a high production schedule, you probably want to develop the skill of learning how to outline for increased efficiency. It's not something that you have to use all the time, which I'm very upfront about in my book. Like, you can use it for only those projects that are really tight deadlines or whatever. But it is a skill worth developing as a writer. It's something to have in your toolbox so you can pull it out when it's the right tool for the job.
All right, and I'm curious too for people who are maybe thinking traditional publishing. Usually one thing you have to submit to an agent is a synopsis. Do you find that your outlining method could kind of help with putting together that 2 to 3 page synopsis too?
Yes, absolutely. It's great for that, especially because it focuses so much on character change and character arc. So if you use it as a synopsis form, which you can almost take the outlining method as is and like send that on as a synopsis. You'll want to make a few changes, obviously, but it is really close to a synopsis in structure. Yeah, because it shows characters so well in it, it also creates a very compelling synopsis. So if somebody looks at it, they're like, well, this story sounds great. It's not just like this happens and then this happens and then this happens. It's like, oh, I can feel like what these characters are going through and where they're going to end up. So yeah, it's a pretty sweet synopsis tool too.
Yeah, I could definitely see that because there's nothing drier than just reading a list of events that happen to characters that you don't yet care about for any reason. So
yeah, yep, that can be rough. And I can see, like, if that's the method that people have been using to outline, I can totally see why they're like, it would be pretty boring.
Yeah, I enjoy putting in, actually, when I do it, it's almost like you're being creative and doing that stuff at the same time, like finding those little characters or those little moments where you just want to make sure and include it later on in the story because it was cool. Like these 2 strapping male characters I have, end up hiding under a bed together so they're not discovered, and that was an outlining tidbit, and then it makes it in the story. So it can definitely be fun.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's very fun personally because I think that's like the most exciting thing to me about writing a story is coming up with like what the character goes through and sort of in your head like seeing them going through this process of like stuff getting harder and harder and like the walls are closing in around them and it's just getting like more difficult. That's the fun part for me is to like figure out how they go through this process. So it's fun to like write it down in advance and be like, this is going to be great. And then I have to actually fill it out with words and I'm like, oh no. So if I could just get people to read nothing but my outlines, they pay me like $4.99 each for that, I'd be so happy.
You might have to pad them just a little bit so they think they're getting their money's worth.
Yeah.
Now, do you usually, will you include snippets of dialogue and things? And how long do you, would one of your outlines be?
That's a great question. That's actually something I'll need to address in a revised edition because I just had a reader contact me recently and he was like, Libbie, you said in the book to get out a piece of paper to start writing down this outline, but I needed like 4 pieces of paper. So I was like, okay, I need to fix that. Yeah, they can be fairly long. So the outlining process that I present starts with, you kind of start with this little 5-part structure, just like in the blurb writing thing, because it sort of focuses on that same internal core of story. So you get that going first, so you have your barest skeleton of the story, and then you start kind of developing it outward into this longer chain of steps in like a character arc. And then you develop those into this longer, like expanded beats where you're sort of filling out you're kind of sketching in more details in each scene as you go along. So yeah, when you get to the point where you're doing beats and you're sort of like fleshing out what these scenes are going to look like, yeah, you can include all kinds of dialogue and stuff you find during research. Since I do historical fiction, I'll find a lot of really neat snippets from history that I want to stick in there. So I'll like pull some quote or something from a history book and like stick it in my outline so I know that I need to cover that in that point. Yeah, you can stick all kinds of stuff in here. It's really fun. It's a marvelously adaptable outlining method that you can sort of kind of customize to fit however you typically enjoy outlining. So it's fun. Everyone should buy my book.
Way to sneak in that subliminal message there.
I know. I'm super subtle.
No problem. That's why we have you here, so we can get the information out and let people know about some good resources.
Yeah.
Now, your comments there on the last question make me wonder if you have any special tool or software you found that's useful for outlining.
Nope. I'm so boring when I've tried to get used to Scrivener and stuff, and I just can't. I've tried so hard, and it just like makes me want to beat my head against the wall. Just Word, I just type stuff. It's terrible. I've started using dictation software to try to hopefully speed myself up even more, but that's taking a while to get used to. But I'm sure at some point I'll end up doing my outlines with dictation software, which is still just writing in Word. So, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like, and I've actually tried it before and not really fallen in love with it, but something like a mind mapping kind of program or something where you can, I know Scrivener has something called Scrapple, I think, that you can have all these note cards, draw lines to them, and
I feel so confused. Just like I feel like the oldest person on the planet when I think about stuff like that. I'm just like, no. I know my just obsessive use of only Word is like the equivalent of people who are like, I still write on a manual typewriter, but I don't care. Like I just get the cold shakes when I think about like mind mapping and note cards that aren't actually held in my hand. Like my brain explodes. I've barely adapted to using an e-reader. It's really shameful. It's terrible.
all right. Well, no, whatever works for anybody, I'm sure. And like I said, I couldn't find an online software that I really liked for the mind mapping, and I'm not going to sit there on the dining room table and have 83 note cards laid out for the entire time I'm writing my novel. So.
Yeah, that's rough. Although I will tell you this, my last day job I had before I started working full time, I worked for a pet insurance company, which was super, super awesome. We had these really great meeting rooms for whenever we'd have to have like brainstorming sessions on stuff, and the walls were just covered in whiteboard material, so you could write like floor to ceiling all the way around the room with whiteboard. I was like, I'm doing that when I have my own office where I can actually like customize the walls. That is 100% what I'm doing. It was awesome because you could write out your entire outline and then like draw lines coming from it and whatever. It's like mind mapping, but in the super stupid slow analog way. It sounds perfect for me.
Oh, that sounds like a good idea too, as long as you don't back up to it and accidentally erase like 3 chapters worth of your outline with your sleeve.
Yeah, sometimes just to bring technology into the super stupid analog way, sometimes we would like fill up a wall and then realize we'd have to erase it, so we'd have to like take pictures with our cell phones and then like erase it all and do our next page. It's terrible.
That's probably a good idea, actually. I never think to do that, to take records with the phone. Just have a couple more questions. I was wondering if, you don't probably get to see as many outlines of people's as you do blurbs, of course, because every book has its own blurb, but are there any mistakes that you've kind of heard about that authors are making when they're outlining, maybe and it's making them less efficient, or it's making them hate it more than they should?
I think mainly focusing on plot first is the biggest mistake, and it's counterintuitive to say don't focus on the plot when you're going to outline or plot a book. It's confusing, I know, but I think that's the mistake right there. I mean, that's where first of all people are burning themselves out and like not having any fun with the process, and like by the time they're done with this stupid outline, they're like, I don't even want to write this book. It's awful. So I think it creates that problem. It also will still create word waste because like if you're doing this plot and you're going through it and you realize that you've just written like 18 boring chapters, you have to go back and like start over, like delete all that, start over again from the beginning. So it's not necessarily more efficient if you're just focusing on plot. So that's why I wanted to share my outlining methods specifically with people, because it's the main focus, aside from those 5 little things that are also in Gotta Read It about writing blurbs. The main focus is not plot at all. The main focus is character arc, pacing, and theme. So you have these 3 little things that are sort of like a tripod that support those little 5 skeletal structures of kind of the core of your story. And that's kind of the way I think, the way you can have a much more efficient and much more enjoyable experience with outlining, so that you're still having fun and you're getting your work done and you're getting it done on time. So hopefully other people find it useful too. So far the reviews have been really good at it, so I think people are kind of connecting with the method.
All right. It could just be that they like the cover, because you got all these sexy underwears on the cover. It's pretty good.
It's true. I mean, it's called Take Off Your Pants, and it's got underpants all over the cover, so it's pretty sweet.
All right. Well, that's about the last question I had for you on outlining. So I think Adam might have had a couple he wanted to ask too, so I'm going to hand you back to him.
All right, sweet.
Yeah, we've had a couple sent over, and then I came up with a few while listening. So speaking of the cover too, I also noticed, again, that guy that I listened to, whoever his name is, who will maybe make it into the show notes, the cover designer said that it's really good in nonfiction to use orange and teal, that it's an emotional response, and you have both of those on your cover, so that's got to be it. It's the underpants and the orange and teal. That's the only reason it's selling, right? So.
Probably, and I just redid a bunch of covers for my older books too, and they have a lot of orange and teal in them also.
Wow. So there must be something to that. But all right. So the questions I have over on the side screen here is, and some of these we may have already covered a little bit. I'm pretty sure the first two we have. So feel free to kind of skip it if we have. So the first one was, do you follow a specific structure for the plot every time? I'm pretty sure you went over that it's not so much plot structured as it is character driven and things.
Yeah, and I think what the person who asked that question may have been sort of obliquely referring to was, do I follow like the 3-act structure or a 4-act structure? And the answer to that is no, I don't. In my opinion, scheduling in like acts specifically into your plot is not necessary. Like, I think it could work. It could work or it could not work. So I think it's not strictly necessary to making a compelling story. I feel really strongly that what makes a compelling story is, first of all, the emotional struggle that a character is going through, and then the specific way you pace a scene and a chapter, which will help you pace the book overall too. And I go over that in the story as well, of how to get like tight pacing in, so you just like make a reader unable to put your book down by just like digging through the pages as fast as they can. I think that's a much more important component than using a specific number of acts or like structuring acts in a certain way. So that's my answer to that question.
All right, we had another one really similar. I think it kind of answers this too, but I'll at least say it. So someone asked if it was your structure was more character-oriented or story theme or a mix. So it sounds like it's a good mix of theme and character more than just rigid structure like we just said. So
yeah.
Let's see. Another one, and again, you talked to Lindsay about this a little bit, about, well, kind of the reverse of it being predictable for the writer, which sounds odd, but there are a lot of people that don't want to plot because they don't want to know what happens. What about for the reader? I guess the criticism is if all authors use the same structure or same plotting techniques, then wouldn't the reader be able to easily predict what's going to happen and get bored of the novel?
Well, I got news for you, folks. We're all using the exact same story structure already. There's really only one when you really boil it down. It's so adaptable. You can put your personal spin on it any way you want. And I think it's a totally valid concern to have. Like, if we all start following, one writer's advice or whatever, we all just gonna all write the same books. But we're all essentially writing the same stories anyway, right? We're all writing a character who wants something, but something stands in his way, so he struggles against it and either succeeds or fails. That's what we're all doing anyway. So I guess the short answer is no, and I could do a much wordier answer on that, but I think the book does a pretty good job of answering the question of why it's not going to make cookie cutter stories every time, except with this like subliminal cookie cutter that nobody really sees unless they look beneath the surface. But once you look beneath the surface, you see it in every story.
Right, and I would say, well, I don't think we have very many readers, readers that aren't authors seeing the show, but one thing that I've noticed since we started writing and plotting and publishing is now when I like watch movies even or TV shows, like I notice those. I was like, oh, there's the inciting incident in the beginning. I'm like, well, crap, now I know what's going to happen. So
I know. It's crazy. My husband gets mad at me, like if we watch stuff together, because we'll get to the end of a movie or whatever, and he'll be like, "What'd you think?" And I'll be like, "Oh, there were plot structure issues." And he's like,
right,
"Oh,
yeah.
Shut up! Did you like it or not?" I'm like, "Well, I can't really like it because the character arc was pretty weak and blah blah blah." Like, it's terrible.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I think maybe, I don't know, 2 months ago we finally watched Frozen with our daughter, and there was one really big glaring plot issue with it, and I kept saying that ever since it happened to my wife. I was like, I can't pay attention to the rest of this. They screwed up there. So
writers are terrible. We're so awful to hang out with.
All right. So the next one is to make sure that the pacing is good, like you said, to make an emotional attachment where they want to keep going chapter to chapter. Do you say that certain kinds of events or certain things need to happen by X words or a % of your final word count, if that makes sense?
No, I didn't think to get that detailed with it because I think a lot of that will depend on a writer's individual style and maybe also on genre conventions. So instead I focus on not only the book as a whole moving toward like this climactic point, but even every chapter and every scene within every chapter having that same sort of like mirroring that same structure of starting out open-ended, and then things start to happen to the character that push them closer and faster towards this decision they have to make at some climactic point. So that applies obviously to the overall story in general. It also applies to every single scene you'll write, where you just like, you start out open-ended and then it just like puts this pressure on them, and it just like shoots them down the chute. And every time they hit some minor climax, like in a chapter or at the end of a scene, they dump out the end of that into another open-ended question that just keeps like funneling them down. It's like a series of funnels that they're just like falling through. So that's kind of how I do it, and I think you can take as many words as you want to do it, or as few as you want, but as long as you clearly have your character kind of being pushed along this series of funnels, it will feel really tightly paced, and people will just go crazy reading it. So.
I agree. One of the best things that I learned about story and plotting over time was that you want to keep increasing the stakes. You want to be really mean to your heroes. Don't be nice to them at all. Just pile on as much as you can, and to keep increasing conflict, because you want the, one step forward, two steps back until you get to that climatic part, pretty much. So.
Yes, exactly. And really, like, one of the things I point out in this book is every chapter and every scene needs to have a fresh problem that your character has to solve. Like, if you write a chapter, I think the example I used in the book is like, if you've decided, in sort of inventing this character that he really likes to travel, so he has a collection of souvenir spoons, and if you write a scene where he just like looks at the spoons and thinks about how cool they are, nothing's happening in that scene. It's got to go. Like, you got to kick that out of the book. If there has to be, some problem happening that he always has to act on, or that something, some force is pushing him closer and closer to a problem with each scene. So, yeah, you gotta think about like what's going to be the issue your character has to solve in every new scene.
What about the collectible spoons niche? I have to look into that.
As long as there's a conflict, someone will find it compelling.
All right, so that was all of the submitted questions. So really quick before we get to the, we got 5 or 10 minutes for the hour mark. So if you're good to answer just a couple marketing questions, I'd love to shoot some at you.
Sure, go for it.
All right, so with your nonfiction, so the other show that we had you on, we talked about how you marketed your genre, or how you got into that niche, and how you worked that niche to get your fiction going. But what about on your nonfiction? Have you done any different marketing with that, or you just rely on paid ads, or none of the above, or?
I haven't done any kind of active marketing on any of these books so far, except for like showing up on podcasts to talk about them, and that's all been. I just threw the blurb book out there because people kept asking me for help with blurbs. I was like, well, here's an ebook on it, and eventually, like, the guys from the self-publishing podcast found it and used it and liked it, so they had me on to talk about that. And since I knew I was going to go on the show that had, this massive reach among other writers, I got Take Off Your Pants done and published before I went on that show, so I could be like, by the way, I also have Take Off Your Pants. So that's all I've done so far with the nonfiction. It is true that I am very laid back when it comes to marketing. I'm not an aggressive marketer at all. So my usual MO, like for my fiction, is to hit up paid ad sites like BookBub and some other ones like that, and to rely very strongly on having like a really good cover, a really good title, which I think is important. Like if I wrote a book called Libbie's Story, who cares, So I think you have to have a title that makes people perk up their ears a little bit, and then having a really great blurb to sell that book. And that's pretty much all I do, and I just sort of like let algorithms and word of mouth kind of push it for me. But I think if you don't have a strong blurb and a strong cover and a strong title, you're doomed from the start. Nothing's going to help you. So.
Well, you made a good point there. I know you said you haven't really been actively marketing much, but you did go on the podcast regarding it. So on that same point, it's often said with fiction work, I know we don't get into nonfiction too much on the show, but nonfiction is defined where the groups of people that need that hang out. Mm-hmm. And the podcasts are perfect for that, because that podcast is listened to by authors, this one as well. And this is a book for authors. So I think that's really important also. If you do write something nonfiction, maybe try to find somewhere that has, podcasts. They've been growing more and more popular and all over the place, not just authors, but there's horror podcasts, TV shows. So
I am a huge fan of podcasts. I mean, because I know how my thing from the time I started my business, like all the way from day one, has always been, what would I look for as a reader? Like if I would respond to that favorably as a reader, I'll do it. If I would be repelled by that as a reader, I won't do it. So like if you go to my website and you like mouse over the sign up for my newsletter and then you mouse away, I don't have a pop-up that shoots at you and it's like, no, sign up for my newsletter, because I would hate that as a reader, so I don't do it. So yeah, I think a lot about where do I go? Where do I hang out? Where do I get my information? And I am a huge podcast consumer. I'm always at the gym, or like I'm listening, while I'm driving around. I listen to podcasts constantly, not just writing podcasts, but other ones too. So I am going to be getting a little more aggressive with my marketing soon. I'm going to be approaching some semi-related podcasts that have nothing to do with books or writing to see if I can target some of my audience that's out there that I haven't tapped yet. So like I'm going to give away like my big secret here. I'm hoping to be able to get advertising on a podcast called Sawbones, which is about medical history. And like I write interesting books about fascinating parts of history. People who listen to this podcast like weird, interesting history. Maybe this is where my readers are. So yeah, I think you have to think a little creatively and figure out, if you were your reader, where would you be hanging out, and how would you be impressed by the presentation of these books? But yeah, I'm other than that, like I'm really super lax about marketing. It's terrible.
So you listen to all these other podcasts aside from ours. So sad.
I listen to Self-Publishing Roundtable a lot, and I didn't even I get so behind on all my podcasts that I can't catch up with them quickly. So I didn't realize you guys had split off into this one.
It's okay.
But
We
here
forgive
I
you.
am. Thanks.
All right, so some of the stuff that you mentioned perfectly goes into the last couple things. So having written both fiction and nonfiction, you were talking about websites, mailing lists, things like that. So I noticed that you didn't create a separate pen name for the nonfiction. Was that, did you think about splitting off and making a separate pen name so that, for instance, someone reading your fiction goes to your Amazon and looks and they say, oh, they're teaching people how to make me like books, that sort of thing. They see your nonfiction, or do you not care about that?
No, I'm not too concerned about it, because I think a whole lot of readers out there are aspiring writers, so I think they might find that interesting. And I also, I'm not writing any books that are like, how to trick people into buying your books, like there's nothing sinister about it. It's just like, here's some stuff about writing. So I didn't do a separate pen name for these particular books. And largely that's also so I want people to be able to go and look at my sales numbers and my reviews and stuff on my fiction and see that I know what I'm talking about too. I do have some other pen names though for genres that really don't cross over well in terms of what typically audience members look for. So I'm a multi-pen name author, but not in this instance.
And so having the fiction and nonfiction on the same name, however, and talking about mailing lists, really hot topic all the time, it seems like you wouldn't want your fiction mailing list to be populated by lots of non-fiction authors or authors in general, just readers. So did you make a separate mailing list just for your nonfiction, or no?
I didn't, and that's mainly because I really only have 2 more nonfiction books in me, and they're both pretty short, and they're pretty niche. They're about historical fiction and about prose style. And that's it. That's the extent of my knowledge, and beyond that, I'm pretty useless. So I'm not going to do a whole bunch of nonfiction books in the future, and I figured it probably wasn't worth the time to set up and pursue, gathering people into a funnel that I would only funnel them towards 2 more books.
Right.
So I was like, meh. So I just focus on my fiction mailing list. I'm sure there are some people who liked my nonfiction stuff who signed up for my mailing list, and they will now get announcements about my fiction, and that's fine. But otherwise, I think authors' blogs and people tweeting about, about this stuff to other writers and podcasts about writing do a pretty good job of getting the word out. So, yeah, probably just do that. Lindsay says in 2020 I'll have 83 more books about nonfiction stuff. I probably will. I've just cursed myself.
Do all kinds of things. I was just seeing, so we were talking about BookBub before. There was a list that went out that was just 50 recipes using eggs or something. It's 27 in the whole Amazon store, and I was like, my God, what am I doing? Writing all these these fiction things that take forever when I could just come up with 50 egg recipes, So
Yeah.
But there you go. I guess the success story there is just BookBub, though. They probably wouldn't have got up there without it. So.
Yeah. probably.
All right. Well, that is the only questions I had. Did you have anything that we sort of skipped over, or anything else you wanted to say, and especially let people know where to find you and your nonfiction books?
No, that's pretty much it. People who are from Canada would be happy to know that I think I finally got the file straightened out with Kobo. For some reason, it just kept not publishing on Kobo, but you should now be able to get Take Off Your Pants on Kobo, or like within 24 hours, whenever it finally resolves. But yeah, just go to your favorite ebook retailer and type in Take Off Your Pants, and you will find my book. I would not recommend typing Take Off Your Pants into Google, especially not if you're at work.
That may be the best advice on the show so far. So.
But if you want to find all of my books, or at least under this pen name, you can go to LibbieHawker.com, and my name is spelled LibbieHawker.
All right, perfect. So it's great having you on again. I say again, Lindsay and I interviewed you on a separate podcast before, so if anyone's listening and thinks, oh, she hasn't been on before, we've talked to her before, so thanks again. And who knows, we may get you on again when you come out with the 83rd nonfiction book that Lindsay was talking about. So.
Okay, if I do end up writing nothing but nonfiction, I'm going to blame you guys forever.
Yeah.
You'll see. Watch. It'll be where the big money is, and you'll be like, maybe I need to make some sequels.
Maybe.
What are 50 ways Egyptians made eggs? That's what you're thinking of. All right, so for everyone listening, if you want to check out the books, you can definitely go directly to them or through Libbie's website. Also, later in the show notes, we'll have the links to all the books, anything we discussed, such as your first book, the Dragon software, which is what most people use for the dictation that you mentioned. So anyone wanting to figure that out, or go to those links quickly, thewritingpodcast.com/15. I'll also say that we do have a resources page now on the Writing Podcast website, just thewritingpodcast.com/resources, and I actually already have your plotting book on there, and I've had it on there for a couple of weeks because I had already picked it up, so you were already featured on there.
Wow, thanks.
Yeah, so if you don't want to wait on the show notes, you can also go there, writingpodcast.com/resources. Lots of books on there that Lindsay and I have found helpful with writing and publishing and things. So, and as always, everyone, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.